A new motion of no confidence has been tabled against the executive mayor of Johannesburg, Dada Morero, escalating the political instability in the city. The motion was put forward by a group of minority parties, including the United Democratic Movement, Jama-ah, African Transformation Movement and the African Heart Congress, who are part of the broader coalition government. The parties cite a number of grievances, including interference in administrative processes, a sustained breakdown of governance and service delivery failures. Now let's chat about more of this, of course, developing story with political analyst Sanet Solomon. Sanet, thank you for your time this evening. We're seeing another motion against, of course, Dada Morero coming from his own coalition partners. Talk to us a little bit about how fragile this government is. And of course, looking at the numbers, this is a very small grouping of people. Will it make a difference at all?
I think that it came as quite a surprise given obviously the fact that it is minority parties that are coming together to actually lay this claim. I think if we look at governance in the city of Johannesburg, I think that there have been a number of challenges for quite some time, and these obviously stem before Morero's time in office. So I do think that if they are saying that it is poor or bad governance, it has to be obviously during the time frame which he's been managing the city. Additionally, what is interesting about the numbers is that there's only 6 of the 270 councillors, and a lot of the larger political parties say that they haven't been consulted to either vote with or to vote with the minority parties against obviously having Morero in office. And what is also interesting is that the ANC, with its 89 votes, is stating that it will obviously be in support of keeping him in place. So I think it'd be interesting to see how it works out.
And I think obviously with the ANC saying that it comes as no surprise. But of course, those numbers, we know when it comes to a motion of no confidence, it's all about the numbers. And having 6 councillors out of the 270, do they actually stand a chance here? Or is it more about sending a political message than actually removing the mayor?
I think it could be both. I think that they obviously could have, because a lot of the time it happens that political parties have had discussions, but they don't necessarily disclose. So I don't necessarily think that they would be able to cause the removal of Dada Morero without having larger parties in place. But it would be interesting to see who the larger parties is that will support them, and obviously how that formation would look. But I think it's fascinating in the run-up to the local government elections, where you have these minority parties that have largely been playing the role of kingmakers doing something like this. And it would be interesting to see whether after the implementation of the coalition bill, should it be implemented, whether these parties, being smaller parties that obviously would have to exceed more than 1%, would be able to still have this kind of influence in terms of these kind of metros and also the larger or smaller municipalities.
And I think it's very interesting that these parties claim that the issues that they are raising are issues of service delivery, yet they are also part of this governance of the city of Johannesburg. But it seems that the heart of this drama is really about the city manager, Floyd Blink. How much of the tension around the mayor and this motion of no confidence really comes down to disagreements over his appointment and, of course, control of the administration?
I think that it could be a big factor because the timing of it is also quite interesting. It is just shortly after we've had this new announcement of the new city manager. And I think maybe they were in disagreements about which candidate they would be going for. But I think what is more important, especially if you are co-governing or governing the city and you care about service delivery and good governance, I think you would want someone in place, because we know that a lot of functionalities can't be completed without having a city manager. And this position has been vacant for way too long. So I think it's a matter of trying to obviously work with your coalition partners, but also seeing whether or not this candidate that has been put in place would be able to actually do the job. And I think that obviously you might not necessarily be in favor of the candidate, but again, if service delivery and good governance are big issues for you, then this is something that you would be willing to concede in.
And we understand, of course, the appointment of the city manager. It's about more than 10 months now since this position, of course, has been vacant. But talk to me a little bit about why, the issue of Floyd Brink was such a contested one in terms of Morero, and as well as the council coming to this decision. We understand that his appointment was put, in the council a couple of times, but failed up until this point. Why is it such a contentious issue for them?
I think that a lot of the times it comes down to obviously positions and wanting to have certain candidates in place. And it could be that you believe that the candidate is not necessarily most suited. However, you would like to qualify what best suited might mean in this instance. And I think that that's what's been causing the back and forth. I think that they probably wanted someone else and they did not necessarily want this particular individual. But again, I mean, if you do have the experience and you do have the expertise, possibly it could be a reason that the other coalition partners were willing to proceed with this despite the contestation from these other larger or rather smaller parties.
And you've described these smaller parties as kingmakers in this position. Talk to us in this case. What kind of leverage do they possibly have over the ANC?
I think that for the longest time, obviously, the ANC has been in coalitions with other parties. And I think with time, they've decided to rather team up with smaller parties so that they would be able to still have certain positions and obviously allocate additional positions to others. And I think that they thought that going into a coalition with smaller parties would result in more stabilization, given the number of seats that it occupies. But I don't necessarily think that that is necessarily the case. So what happens with these smaller parties is because larger parties are looking for coalitions partners, they generally tend to merge with smaller parties. And I think that's why they have so much of influence, because you could have instances where you could have, for example, the DA and the ANC working together, but then there might be clashes in terms of what they would want to do, the decisions that they'd want to make, etc. Whereas there's a perception that if you work with a smaller political party, that you might be able to wield more influence. And I think that with all of these recent moves, we see that it's not necessarily the case, that smaller parties do want to have more say, despite having fewer seats in the council.
And of course, on the one hand, we've got political parties questioning Dada Morero's competence. On the other, informal traders in the city of Johannesburg are taking him to court. How would one describe the current climate in the city of Johannesburg, specifically when it comes to leadership and, of course, residents caught in the middle of all of this?
I think that there is a lot of turmoil in Johannesburg. I think that it could be better managed. I do think that they could be doing quite a bit to help the residents. I mean, every other day there are communities that are sitting either without water and or without electricity. And in some cases, it's both of those. But there are other services that are also not being rendered. I mean, we don't have to talk about the potholes and people trying to evade that. We know that there are high levels of unemployment in terms of the city. And it's quite strange given the status of the city economically in terms of the country. So that's also not working. Then you have informal traders being told that they have to have certain licenses, etc., but not necessarily assisting them with procuring or actually getting access to those without going through punitive measures. So I do think that a lot can be done. I do think that residents are unfortunately stuck in this political turmoil, and I think that we could do better.
And Sanet, perhaps maybe you would agree with me or disagree with me, but I think what we saw happening outside the Johannesburg High Court is only the beginning, given the fact that we're now starting to see this cleanup in the city ahead of the G20. I think your reaction as well to what is really being seen on the ground. Are we preparing perhaps for more G20 resistance?
I believe so. I think that obviously you would like to have your city look what people would quote unquote term presentable. I think that they'd like to put our best foot forward in terms of showing like the city in a neat and clean state. I think that for some reason, I think that they would like to assimilate Johannesburg a little bit more to what people think of when they think of Cape Town, South Africa. And I think that that could obviously result in some of these changes that we've seen taking place. But I also think that South Africans need to be quite honest about the fact that a lot of people are dependent on those informal traders. For example, if you look at the people, a lot of people living off minimum wage, not necessarily being able to go to a fast food chain, etc., and then buying from these informal traders on the side of the road. We've seen the lot of contestation in terms of clothing being sold on the side of the road, etc. There are people who can't necessarily afford to go to even cheaper retail chains. So I think that what we're seeing in Johannesburg is actually what is happening in terms of the country. I think it's systematic of the inequality in the country. I think it's systematic or symptomatic rather of the lack of employment opportunities and people actually trying to find a way to make an income. And I think that in terms of obviously presenting the city as well managed, etc., I think that we shouldn't necessarily just take away the livelihoods of people, but find ways for them to become part of that formal economy. And I think with this, possibly we'll see more discussions of taking the informal economy and trying to formalize it and trying to find ways for people to generate an income, obviously by abiding to the bylaws of the city without necessarily losing their livelihoods and being pushed out of the city.
Certainly a lot to unpack there. Thank you so much for your time. That was, of course, political analyst Sanet Solomon.